Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hello Michelle.
Hi Caroline.
Our last chat for the year.
That's right.
And you made it. Congratulations.
A big fortnight in Parliament.
It has been a big fortnight in Parliament. It's been a big 12 months. Okay, so let's look at Parliament. It was the last sitting for 2020 and we saw a rush of new legislation, including industrial relations reforms and a big challenge to the tech giants about payment to news organisations over the use of their content, and ongoing debate about climate change. But firstly, so today National Cabinet is meeting, I also think for the last time for this year. What's on the agenda for today's meeting?
Well, they will be looking at the pandemic issues and where things are up to. It's interesting that this has been the first face-to-face meeting for months and months and months, since right at the start of the pandemic, and they had dinner at the Lodge last night. And
are they all there though?
But they're not all there because Mark McGowan decided that he couldn't be in the same room under his rules as Stephen Marshall from South Australia. So that's a bit of a farce, but he will be there virtually.
Okay, and what will they talk about today?
One thing that they will be likely to talk about is the latest news on the vaccine, because one of the vaccines, the Queensland one, has fallen out because of some medical issues, and so we're rather reduced. But the Prime Minister had a news conference early today and said, because we have these multiple vaccines on order, that everything's still on track.
Okay, great. Let's turn briefly to climate change. I mean, so 2020 began with a debate about climate change, the bushfires and whether or not the government's response was adequate. The year is ending with the same debate, effectively. This weekend, there's an international climate conference being hosted by Britain, France and the UN, and Scott Morrison, it's been confirmed, hasn't been invited to speak. Why?
Basically because the speakers are supposed to up their ambitions. It's got ambition in its title, this climate conference, and although he was hoping to say there that Australia won't need to use carryover credits to meet its targets under the Paris Agreement, that wasn't thought to be ambitious enough. So he is speaking tonight to a Pacific Island Forum climate meeting, and he will say what he's got to say, where he's up to on climate in that speech, but is not going to get the opportunity to address this wider audience. I think while he's saying that this is all fine by him, cracking hardy over it, that he would be disappointed because he had expected, I think, to get a speaking slot.
There are other leaders, though, who aren't on the list. I understand Jacinda Ardern isn't on the list either, is that right?
I think that's right, but nevertheless, it's a question of expectations. And of course, because climate is such a sensitive political issue, I think that Scott Morrison would have liked to have been in the lineup speaking.
Okay. Industrial relations, there's been a lot of debate about that this week with the introduction of industrial relations reform legislation. Now, there's a lot of things in that legislation. What's the key aim of the suite of reforms? Can you talk us through that a bit?
The government has said that it's not trying to fundamentally alter the system, it's trying to tidy it up and make it more flexible. So the reforms basically go to that, and the argument has been this week particularly about the so-called boot test, the better off overall test, which means that in enterprise agreements, people have to be judged against the award and better off compared to that. Now, the present legislation does have a provision that the boot doesn't have to be met if there are exceptional circumstances. And what the government's proposing is to make the pandemic an exceptional circumstance for a couple of years, so that businesses that have been really hit by the pandemic could be exempted from the boot test. Labor has jumped onto this, and the unions have too. The unions say they weren't consulted in those very extensive discussions that ran for weeks and weeks earlier in the year. And Labor and the unions say this is a path to cutting wages. Now, I think this is a real exaggeration, frankly, but for Labor it is important to grab an issue, and industrial relations is always a fertile issue for it, because after all, work choices is still within political memory.
In comparison to work choices, though, these changes, do they compare in their severity?
No, they don't. They don't compare, and while they can be debated, for example, they deal with casuals and the movement to permanent employment, they deal with higher penalties for wage theft or wage underpayments, things of that sort. And apart from the boot test, they also do make enterprise bargaining or getting agreements ticked off a rather simpler, speedier process. But they are not dramatic changes. I think that the government is indicating that it will be flexible, that it will compromise, because it doesn't want to have a huge stoush running through next year on industrial relations. So it's a sort of pragmatic debate that is starting, even though there's a lot of heat and a bit of confected emotion, frankly, coming into it from the critics of the legislation.
Yes, because the union, the ACTU said that it was blindsided by these changes, particularly in relation to the boot aspect. That they were saying that after months of cooperation, that this had never been put on the table. Is that a genuine claim? I mean, why would the government not raise this earlier if there was this level of cooperation going on?
I think that they did hear about it within the last fortnight or so, but it has been put in at a late stage, and I think that it was a representation by employers, and the critics of the legislation do say that the whole thing favours employers, and that's probably correct, but it's in total not a really drastic set of changes.
I mean, the changes, I mean, there is good news for casual workers in the bill. Is it not a good thing for casual workers who've been casual for a long time to be able to be made permanent? Is that
well,
not a good
look,
thing?
it all depends where you're coming from and how you look at these things. There's a path for casual workers to be offered permanency, but there is a let out for employers not to make that offer if they've got reasonable grounds. So it can work both ways.
Okay. Still on unions, now Labor has supported government legislation to allow the breakup of super unions like the Construction, Forestry, Maritime, Mining and Energy Union, the CFMEU. What's driven their support of this?
Well, this was remarkable because Labor agreed to this proposal, and the whole thing went through both houses in a day.
In lightning speed.
And very quickly in each house. What this is all about is that the former officials of the CFMEU have really become sick of the behaviour of the construction section, and Tony Marr, the president of the union, who recently resigned his position after a campaign against him by parts of the construction division, and that division, of course, the big name there is John Setka. He did a deal, essentially. Ma did a deal with Christian Porter, the minister, for this bill, which allows the demerger. And what we'll see now that the bill's gone through is early next year, the mining division of the union, which is led by Ma, move out of the wider union. And I think the manufacturing division could go also sometime next year. That's a bit less certain, but that's headed by Michael O'Connor, who is brother of Brendan O'Connor, Labor frontbencher. So the Labor Party knows a lot about the internals of this union and the fairly ugly things that have happened internally, as well as, of course, the bad behaviour of the construction division externally.
Okay. So not only is the government taking on the super unions, it's also taking on the tech giants, Google and Facebook. It has tabled legislation to force them to negotiate with news organisations over the payment for the use of their journalism content. Look, how will it work, and do you think it will be a difficult process?
I think it will be a difficult process, but what will happen is that these companies, these tech companies, will have to reach commercial deals, or we're supposed to reach commercial deals with the traditional media to pay for the content they take. Now, if they can't reach those agreements, then arbitration will kick in. The government wants them to do the agreements outside the code if possible, but it was becoming very clear that there wasn't going to be a consensus on a voluntary system, and therefore the government has put in or will put in this mandatory code. I think that it's generally recognised that this is very important in a situation where the business model of the traditional media has been, so undermined by the digital disruption.
There is negotiation, though, already occurring, I understand, between those tech platforms and
That's
individual
right.
news outlets.
And there's been reporting that a deal's fairly close with News Corp.
Now, but the code itself doesn't set payment rates or anything like that.
No,
does
it doesn't. It doesn't. It does. There is a provision that account has to be taken of the advantage that traditional media get from the fact that they get more eyeballs if their content is used. But no, that's a matter for negotiation, the actual terms of the commercial deals.
Now, originally the SBS and ABC were not included in the draft code, but they have been included. Do you see any potential risk down the track that the government might use this as a leverage to cut funding to the public broadcaster if it is receiving commercial funding, which is it doesn't fit well with its, their codes of independence?
Well, that did look to be a potential danger, and I actually asked the Minister, Paul Fletcher, about this the other day. He said there would be no attempt to recoup that money. He also made the point that the ABC has said that the funds they get under such deals will go to regional journalism.
Okay. So, as we go into 2021, everyone having a bit of a break, though, hopefully over Christmas. No bushfires, hopefully. What's the state of the major parties, and how are things looking for Anthony Albanese? Let's just get straight into that one.
Okay, well, I think if we can start with the Prime Minister, I think he has had a good year out of a bad year, if I can put it that way, because of course the virus has been a terrible thing for the country, but it could have been so much worse. When we compare ourselves to the United States, to Europe, we are and we need to touch wood at this point,
Yes.
we are in a very strong position at the moment. And I think there's been general agreement that the government has handled things well. Now, there have been mistakes, there's been bumpiness in the National Cabinet, there's been disagreement, but when you take the helicopter view, I think both the federal government and the state governments have done pretty well. There's the exception, of course, of the quarantine fiasco in Victoria. But
hey, things are going well at the moment.
That's right, and nationally they're going well. So Scott Morrison started off in a terrible position with the bushfire mishandling. Now he's coming out of this year, going into the next year, in a strong position. As for Anthony Albanese, I think he is not in a good position. There's been, of course, great difficulty for the opposition to get heard and to strike the right sort of position during the pandemic. People don't want political infighting. I think that is still the case, even though the opposition, of course, has had to ramp up its criticism and find things to argue about more recently. But it's been just blotted out by the fact that everybody's attention has been on the pandemic and the consequences, health consequences, economic consequences. Within the Labor Party, there is now quite a lot of criticism of Albanese's performance. People feel that even given or even making allowance for the difficulties of the situation, that he's not delivered on the promise that he might have shown in the beginning. And there's muttering, there's talk about alternatives, but there's not agreement on any alternative. So I think as he goes into 2021, his position is not secure. It's not certain he will lead to the next election, but equally it's not a case of saying, well, he's certain to be overthrown, to be replaced during the year. It's just a very uncertain situation, but it is true that members of the party are worried about, those in marginal seats are worried about their seats, and that's always a difficult situation for a leader. And also there's no sort of clear pathway for the Labor Party to take. It's got a conference early next year and it's got policies to settle, especially its climate and energy policies, and it's got to find issues, and that's why we've seen it jump on industrial relations. So I think with Labor, the picture is very murky at the moment.
Given that Morrison is doing well and is in a relatively strong position and has managed the COVID situation well, the economy seems to be improving slowly. Is it sensible, though, for Labor to change leaders at this point, given that they're likely to lose the election anyway? Why burn another leader, potential leader?
I think this is a very pertinent point. And there's also the point that things can change so quickly. You know, if we'd have been talking in the middle of the bushfires, we would have been saying, well, Morrison's future, or the government's future is shakier, that Morrison was performing badly. So you can get dramatic changes of situations. I think in terms of the leadership, because there's no settled alternative, it's not like you've got one potentially really standout leader in the wings, then it does raise questions about the wisdom of changing. And as you say, you wouldn't want to burn off somebody who's going to be good in the future. For example, if Jim Chalmers was put in, lost the election, he would then be in a much more difficult position to go forward as leader in the next term. But the counterpoint is, if you're an MP in a marginal seat and you think, well, X will give me a better chance than Y being Albanese, then you are more inclined to be receptive to the argument of change.
So what does he need to do? He needs to lift his energy, he needs to pick more fights. I mean, what does Albo need to do, you think, to recover his position within the membership?
Sometimes there's no one answer or one set of answers. It's just an incredibly difficult situation, and I think the community does relate quite well to Albanese. Anecdotally, if you go out and about, people like him in a way that they didn't relate to Bill Shorten. But nevertheless, there's also a feeling, well, why would you change? And we're still away from the election, of course, but why would you change if things seem to be going all right? So there really isn't one clear strategy Labor can adopt. If it tries to argue about issues more, if it tries to grab everything that's passing, it runs the risk of just annoying the electorate rather than gathering support.
You know, it will be obviously the big thing to watch into the start of next year as to what happens and how that's resolved by the party. So this is our last chat for the year, Michelle. Thanks very much for everything. I hope you have a great rest and a great Christmas, and we'll see you next year.
And to you and to our viewers.